I've been waiting for you by J. Wilburn. Have you been? Agent John Perkins asked the elderly inmate on the couch in front of him. All right, let's add a couple things here. He took a moment to finish getting the old man in frame on the camera upon the tripod. He took a moment to finish getting the old man in frame on the camera upon the tripod. It wasn't much bigger than his phone, and he hit record. Perkins took a moment to look around the modest day room. Of course, Stone Crow sat here alone. He was the only prisoner assigned to this facility in the upper eastern corner of Alabama. People driving by outside would probably mistake it for a law office or maybe a quiet dental practice. All in all, it wouldn't be all that bad a place to retire. The Alabama prison system wanted it closed because Stone Crow was the last man assigned to it, and he didn't seem inclined to die. One orderly stood close by with his arms crossed. Let's see. James was the fellow's name. He looked more Latino or Native American than the pale-skinned Stone Crow did, despite his unusual name. Let's say distinctive, despite his distinctive name. All right. Perkins wasn't sure if the big man was there to protect him or looking out for Stone Crow. A guard, a few years past retirement, slept up behind the reception desk. Perkins didn't give a damn what that guy's name was. All right. Perkins and James. No, I should have left that there. And James, the orderly. I think that's how you spell orderly when it's the person. I may have to look that up. All right. Perkins and James, the orderly, both wore masks over their mouths and noses to protect Stone Crow from any and all super germs. I guess super germs would be compound, don't you think? Yes, it is. All right. The task had been simple when Perkins came on as a consultant. As the pandemic revved up at the beginning of the year, the prison system wanted to release the inmates it could, especially the elderly, and close facilities to make up for state budget shortfalls. One prison nursing home with one prisoner seemed to be an easy call, but then he met Stone Crow. Crow said, "I was. Figured you'd need more explanation about things." "So explain, inmate Crow." Stone Crow just chuckled and looked toward the TV that was turned all the way down. Perkins saw the old man wasn't going to answer or didn't remember the answer. He checked the record light on the camera and started talking. All right. "Well, Mr. Crow, I found that you were transferred here from South Carolina, not here, but the Alabama prison system, and then you got old and was moved here. Does that sound familiar?" The corner of Stone Crow's mouth twitched, and he said, "I recall being old when they transferred me the first time." "Interesting you should say that," Perkins said. "I had to dig to find the record of the transfer. Had to go to South Carolina to find the date. Do you remember your transfer date? It was in the spring, I seem to recall. Well, it was early fall, but it was in 1979. You were supposed to go back after the renovations were done at Grinder State Prison in Fuller Beach, South Carolina. There was a hurricane. It took out part of the prison. Do you remember that? Crow answered as if... Okay, I need to put a question mark there, sorry. Crow answered as if Perkins were asking a general question about the weather back in coastal South Carolina. Hot as balls down there in solitary. You were in solitary at Grinder State a few times. Everyone is eventually. I found your transfer records all yellow and brittle in a forgotten file room. Can't find anyone or any record in either state to say what you actually did. Do you remember your charge, inmate Crow? The old man laughed, and it descended into crackling coughs the way old lungs tend to do. If no one knows, I guess I'm innocent. Better let me go. This is where I added the guy's name in, so I couldn't keep saying orderly. James laughed. James laughed at that. We really need to find out what you did before we can do that, Perkins said. Do you want to be released? Do you want to be released? Let's put a question mark there. Oh gosh, I got something on my nose. Crow shrugged, but one shoulder didn't rise quite as much as the other. I'm kind of long in the tooth to be getting a fresh start. I get fed and taken care of here. We got, we got the Netflix. All right. Perkins glanced at the television and shook his head. Yeah, they aren't too thrilled paying for your upkeep. Like I've said before, I didn't ask to be kept when this all started. Do you remember that date, the date you were originally sentenced? It escapes me. It's been a while. Do you know how old you are? Don't recall. Do you have a ballpark guess? Stone shook his head and his eyes lost focus as if he were staring at something far away, maybe back to his distant past. Well, Alabama was happy to transfer you back to South Carolina. The orderly uncrossed his arms. Hold on. We'll say James again. James uncrossed his arms. Are they doing that in the middle of a pandemic? Perkins couldn't see the orderly's mouth through the mask, but his eyes expressed a lot. He asked the big man, "Are you afraid of losing this cush job?" I'll land on my feet. I'm worried about his safety. Perkins stared a moment longer and then turned his attention back on the mysterious old man. Turns out, inmate Crow, that there was a snag. You weren't originally imprisoned in South Carolina either. Looks like you were transferred there from Georgia. Do you remember that at all? I lived in Georgia a while, went out west on some adventures, and eventually came home. Perkins waited a moment, but then continued. Those records were even harder to find. We don't even know for sure if Georgia was your state of sentencing or whether you were charged with a federal or state crime. Do you remember your prison assignment from Georgia? Stone Crow sat and stayed stone still and silent this time. His face was turned away, but not at the television. He didn't seem to be focused on anything. Perkins leaned down to be sure the old man's eyes were still open. They were, but it was impossible to tell if his mind was still with them. The only documents I could find said that you were transferred from a facility called Blood Mountain. Hell of a name for a prison. Do you remember that? Stone Crow took a deep breath. It accented all his fragile bones through his thin skin. Perkins was about to go on, but Crow said, there was a lot of outdoor tents when that place got crowded. A lot of nasty shit took place on those days. It really was way up in the mountains, hot as all hell in the summer and cold in the winters. The fact that you remember it bothers me a great deal, Perkins said, because for the longest time I couldn't find it, not anywhere. The Georgia prison system had no record of the place. I dug a little deeper and found that it closed in 1929. Were you sentenced to prison back in the 1920s, Mr. Crow? Have you been in one jail or another for over 100 years, sir? Let's say the orderly's eyes were wide again, but this time James leaned forward like this was quite a point of interest. It was interesting, but none of the three prison systems Perkins had to bother in order to dig up all this detail up. Liked interesting stories all that much. They sure didn't like mysteries. Crow gave a crackling laugh cough again. I was gone before that. The flu ran through that place like fire and took out most of the guards and prisoners. There were a few days where no one was there to serve us food. Folks just died and got left where they lie. More than once, I could probably have strolled right out with no one well enough to stop me. I got transferred to Grinder. The Grinder. I got transferred to the Grinder once all that had passed and they needed to rebuild. Perkins met eyes with James. And leaned closer to Stone Crow, who looked very sharp and alert now. And let's get that right. And you're talking about the Spanish flu. You're saying you were there at Blood Mountain in 1919 and 1920, 100 years ago. Perkins wasn't big on history. This case was the most historic research he had done in an age. However, with the current pandemic, everyone knew about Spanish flu from the last century again. Crow's eyes gleamed out of his wrinkled face. The place was young when I got sent up. I grew old with it and outlived it too. What do you think about that? I'm not sure what to think, Mr. Crow. I can't figure out what you did or how long ago that was. Crow licked his chapped lips and said, Did you think to find the date the Blood Mountain opened? All right, continuing on. Perkins shook his head. Now Crow leaned forward, and Perkins shifted back as the old man spoke low. Now Crow leaned forward, period. Perkins shifted back and adjusted the camera as the old man spoke low. I don't recall the date myself, but before I went in, we were riding horses instead of self-driving cars. There was no Netflix to chill to, no TV of any color, no radio neither, as I recall. What does that tell you? All right, let me fix a typo there. If you're telling me the truth, Perkins said in an even voice, then you are maybe the oldest man on earth and not just the oldest guest of the Alabama prison system. It's my brother's fault I got sent up, Crow said. What did your brother do? What do all rats do? He squeaked. So he turned you in. What for? No, for what? Trouble out west. If you're telling the truth, that trouble would be in the cowboy and Indian days or close to them. Those days were longer upon the earth than most people know. Crow settled back into the couch, but he kept talking. I don't know what goes on across the West these days, but in my day, let's say, comma, there were strange things still lurking in the deserts. Ancient magic, old curses, gods older than men and wilder than any demon mentioned in the good book. Did you encounter something unexplainable out there, Crow? Perkins asked. Sometimes I found the unexplainable every day. What did you do that your brother could tell on you for? I got up to some mischief in Georgia. It wasn't enough to involve the law, but it was close enough to send me packing to avoid a girl's angry brothers. I got out there where women was loose, but the money was tight. Whiskey and gambling started out cheap, but the cost stacked up. I ran from that too, and people started to follow. Were any of those people the law? Perkins asked. Not at first, but to pay off some debts I got mixed up with some bad men. Mostly just petty theft and small robberies, not banks. There were guys who went for banks and threw enough lead to get away with it, but there were easier targets. Were you both in prison for robbery? Were you put in prison for robbery? Stone showed a few discolored teeth and said, You want to hear it or not? Perkins waved Crow on. He didn't want to stop the man's flow anymore for fear that his mind would slip or he'd simply clam up again. Let's put a comma there. All right, continuing on. Crow nodded and continued his story. A few people got hurt, as tends to happen. Dangerous land and dangerous times. Other gangs killed folks, and the law wasn't all that particular about catching the right man. Any man with a pass would do to settle the townfolk. Is that townsfolk? No, I'm going to keep it. They want to put the S in to make it grammatically correct, but this is dialogue. So I split with my little gang. Wasn't anyone who you would have heard of. We were nothing special, but I did have a pesky marshal and his lady sidekick on my trail. I kept going west into harsher and harsher land, figuring John Law would grow tired, get lost, or his lady friend would nag him into taking her back into the more comfortable east. Should have known better. I think it were the lady. All right. Fixing that. I think it were the lady that drove him on and on. After she passed, he was a lot more docile, and he visited me a number of times in Blood Mountain. Did you kill her? Perkins dared to interrupt again. Crow shook his head. No, but not for lack of trying, I'll admit. Just outlived her like I do everyone else. Crow smiled, and Perkins smiled back, but his was hidden under his mask. Outlived that marshal, too. He didn't look so good the last time he came to see me. Let's say James. James cut in. Did he die of Spanish flu? Crow smiled even wider, and the expression made him look insane. Nah, he died a good 25 or 30 years before all that. Perkins wanted to push that point. It was impossible, but he had no way of disproving it. The marshal who chased this old man across the West died of old age, probably a decade before the start of the 20th century. Even if he was already old when they started, that still made Stone Crow impossibly old now. Taking all the self-control he had, he just said quietly, Go on. Crow continued. We ended up in some mountains that to this day I swear weren't on any map. I'd not be the least bit surprised to find them missing from maps today, even that Google Earth thing. After he paused, Perkins nodded. Crow nodded back and said, I took up in some caves that had dinosaur bones embedded in the walls. The marshal's pet bitch sniffed me out, and I had to retreat deeper into the caves. Down deeper there was glowing moss that lit the way. There were sea creatures of impossible size fossilized down there. Folks would say it were from Noah's flood, but the deeper I retreated, the less I believed these were creatures created by any god that's worshipped today. James, okay, let's change this. Again, I gave the orderly a name, so I wasn't constantly saying the orderly. James and Perkins leaned forward as they listened. Crow didn't even seem to notice they were still in the room. He stared through walls at something thousands of miles away and buried in a different century. Down there, I started hearing things, voices in forgotten tongues, growls of men turned mad. I was running back to the arms of the marshal when those men lit upon me. They were rotten, their skins slawed from their bones, their eyes was black, and slime oozed from their toothless mouths. They infected me with something worse than Spanish flu or this new bat virus that's got everyone worked up today. Were they zombies? James asked. Let's say James the orderly. James, the orderly, asked. Crow shrugged one shoulder without breaking his 1,000-mile stare. Not sure there was a word for them then or now. I go running right between the marshal and his girl. They come running, but not to catch me. They were trying to escape as well. If those things had gotten hold of them, I'm not sure they would have fared as well as me. We flee out into the sun, and a few of those melting men come after us. The sun didn't kill them, but sure to this day they can be killed. Not sure to this day they can be killed, but they started smoking and turned char black. Blue flames licked up from their eyes. The three of us fled on horseback. Finally, the monster men gave up the chase, and the marshal tries to tell me I've been arrested. There was plenty he could get me on, but none of the stuff he said was what I actually done. We end up in a shootout in some isolated town near the border. At first, everyone stayed inside. Then what I was carrying got to a couple of them. They go crazy and start attacking the others. The thing spreads until we three are fighting for our lives again and not each other. This cat and mouse game continued across the desert, going mostly north. Let me fix a typo there. I must have cleared out 5 towns with that deadly madness. Let's say I was carrying like a cold bug. All right. Eventually, I was too sick to go on. I holed up in an old cabin in an abandoned town. I was sick unto death. Lord knows I wanted to be there for a while. I saw things, heard things, and knew secrets I had no business knowing. I came out of it, though. Let me put a word in there. I came out of it, though. The stuff I'd seen haunted me for years. Forgetting is one of the great gifts of growing old that most people don't appreciate. That marshal and his bulldog girlfriend nearly had me 2 more times. The battles were just as violent, but I wasn't spreading madness everywhere I went. Anymore. So I escaped him and came back home to Georgia. I got in a bar fight. A couple guys got hurt, but no one was killed. My brother told on me because he was sweet on the local law's daughter. I ended up locked up for about a month. I think. When I got out, I confronted him. The fight started out about the betrayal, but then got to be about everything else that ever passed between us. He hit me with the butt of my own pistol. Hit me in the head with the butt of my own pistol. Honest to God, I think that's where my memory problem started. I saw red and had learned to be a violent man on those hard trails. I took the gun from him and beat him to death with it. I was on the run again, but leaving Georgia, I drew the attention of my marshal once more. It was his girl who finally caught me, and I fought her harder than my brother. I hurt her pretty good. She limped from that day on, but she beat me down into the dust. They found it hard to try me for the things out west. Some of the original crimes they liked me for had been pinned on others by then. Turning a whole town mad because of some ancient curse wasn't going to play in front of a judge, so they settled on taking me back to Georgia to stand for the murder of my brother. That's what I was convicted for, but really the marshal saw me punished for all the trouble I caused him along the way. There was silence for a while. The guard out front gave one deep snore. James, again, I named him, so I wouldn't keep saying the orderly. James finally said, "Jesus Christ." Perkins shook his head. They won't be early releasing you if your charge was really murder. The orderly said, "How many life sentences has he served at this point? I think that his time might be long up." Perkins chewed at the inside of his mouth and then stood up. "I'm not sure I can..." And then stood up. Let's say... He turned off the camera and the screen went dark. "I'm not sure I can sell that he's been in prison for over 100 years. Do you recall the judge's name or the date of your trial? Maybe what town in Georgia it was? Probably the one you lived in, right?" Stone Crow shook his head as his eyes looked dull again. "I don't recall any of those details." "Not even your hometown?" Crow's brow furrowed, but then relaxed. "I've lived lots of places. They all blend together after a while. Since that spell in the cabin passed, I haven't been sick a day in my life since. Not during the first epidemic in '88, nor the big outbreak in 1919. I'll be surprised with this new virus. I'll be surprised if this new virus can do anything to me either." 1888, Perkins thought. God in heaven. All right, let me italicize that. 1888, Perkins thought. God in heaven. He took a couple tries to get the camera off the thin tripod. He pocketed the device and wrestled the tripod, to get the tripod folded down. All right. James followed Perkins to the front as the agent held the tripod tucked under his arm. All right. Stone Crow called out, "Turn my damn TV back up." "You got the remote right next to you," James shouted back. Perkins wasn't sure why, but the fact that James shouted at Stone Crow like that made him feel better. The guard's snores stole that good feeling away again. All right. The programs, let's say the Netflix program sound blared back up as the pair reached the front door. The sleeping guard had never locked it since Perkins came in. James asked, "What the hell are you going to do now? What's going to happen to him?" "I have no idea," Perkins said as he pushed the door open on the hot day outside. "I guess I'm making a trip back to Georgia and trying to track down records on a very old murder trial. I hope to God he was going by the name Stone Crow back then, too." "Good luck," the orderly said. James looked... Okay. It wouldn't be Netflix because he didn't pause it. The television program sound All right, there we go. James looked behind him and then asked, "Are you ever going to try to track down that mysterious cave he mentioned?" Kind of outside, let's say, Perkins. Perkins felt cold thinking about that. Kind of outside the scope of the mystery I'm trying to solve. James nodded and stepped back from the door. Probably for the best. Perkins shook his head and left. "Good luck," the orderly. "Good luck," the big orderly said before the door closed between them. Agent John Perkins took out his phone on the way to his car and held his hand over the camera in his pocket. But I'm going to need to add him in here. But he couldn't decide how the hell to report all of this. All right. That's I've Been Waiting for You. Might be better to call it I've Been Waiting for You a Long Time. I've already named the story in the pictures I've made, but that might be interesting. I'm going to put that in there for now. I've been waiting for you a long time. All right.